Testing, testing. could have everyone's attention, please. We're going to be starting the service in just a moment. We're going to be starting with the ancient ritual of Kriya. Rabbi Gutmann and Cantor Susan Lewis-Friedman will be doing a little prayer with the family right now. Before we begin, if you have a cell phone, if you wouldn't mind just turning the cell phone off or just putting it on the vibrate mode, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
A voice says, "Cry out." And I say, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when a wind of the eternal blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the eternal shall endure forever. Friends, we gather here in sadness as we commit to loving rest our dear Ralph L. Halpern, our friends, his family, and so many touched by his life grieve. The world is now darker. In their silence there is lamentation. In their tears there is loneliness. Lost in their sorrow, may they find the presence of loving friends, of loving colleagues, of a loving community that can help them. And so we ask you, O God, to hear them, to be with them for Ralph's love that united us in life and which death cannot sever, for his companionship that we shared along life's path and which continues through the tenderness of memory, for the gifts of his heart and mind that brought us happiness and is now a precious remembrance, For all these and more, we give our thanks to God. In this time of grief, we listen to the voice of our sacred scriptures that bring us the ever-new message of God's nearness. They tell us of our kinship with the Creator in light as in darkness, in joy as in sorrow, in life as in death. The 15th Psalm. Adonai, Eternal One, who may abide in your house? Who may dwell in your holy mountain? Those who are upright, who do justly, who speak the truth within their hearts, who do not slander others or wrong them or bring shame upon them, who scorn the lawless but honor those who revere God, who give their word and come what may do not retract, who do not exploit others, who do not take bribes. Those who live in this way shall never be shaken. I can't say this all the time, but I can say that I think unequivocally Ralph lived by those words that I just read. Every day, Ralph committed so much energy to his values, his ideals, and the opportunity to be able to make our world better. Ralph also much preferred the words of English and found them important for all of us, because the essence of what we're saying is the meaning of these words, that they instill in us strength and inspiration, and that they help to support us as we go along our way. And so I'll be trying to share heavily in the English throughout this service to honor you, Ralph. One prayer I would like to, though, call on my dear colleague who had the opportunity to meet him in the 6 months that she's been here at this congregation, and would like to share as a setting for Psalm 121 in the English.
A familiar setting. I invite you to sing along, particularly on this beginning part, as I'm sure you will maybe have heard this setting with, and we were going to do this with English. Yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai. Give it a try. Yai dai 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 dai, 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 dai 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 dai. Try. Yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai. I lift up my eyes unto the mountains. From whence will my help come? I lift up my eyes unto the mountains. From whence will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, creator of heaven, creator of earth. My help comes from the Lord, creator of heaven, creator of earth. Yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai.
Many of you had the opportunity to take programs that were on your way into the sanctuary, and I'd like to encourage you to open up to the inside right panel at this moment. to recite what are likely the most familiar words from settings such as this, a psalm that speaks of feeling God's presence supporting us always, even in moments when we feel the shadow of death and of loss. So if you'd like to join me for Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, who maketh me to lie down in green pastures, who leadeth me beside the still waters, who restoreth my soul, who leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for thy name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It's a great thing to be able to look out and knowing how beloved your father, your grandfather, great-grandfather was by this congregation, and all of the past presidents that are here who understood the way that Ralph for us was a pillar, a rock in this community. Among them, there are individuals who knew him exceptionally well, and among the past presidents, actually two partners of Ralph from periods of his time practicing law, Howard Rosenhawk and David Brock. And I'd like to call upon David Brock, if I could, to share some remarks, some thoughts about Ralph.
I've been asked to talk about Ralph from the point of view of a past president, and I will, I promise. But there's so much more of Ralph that I've enjoyed. I've been privileged to have known him for at least 40 years in a number of different capacities. He was a law partner of mine for 30 years at Jacob Fleischman and Mughal. He was a member of the Bar Association Ethics Committee that I sat on and chaired for longer than that. He was my mentor as a past president, as I think he was for almost every past president after him. And he was also a frequent luncheon partner of mine, both while we were working and up until recently after he had retired. Ralph always took a keen interest in the world around him, whether it was in the law we practiced every day, in what was shaping the world politically, or in the people he dealt with. At Temple, every incoming new leader, whether it was lay or clergy, would, and I'm not exempt from that, believe me, was treated to a visit from Ralph early on, complete with a history lesson, a discussion of the issues facing the temple, and his ready solutions for solving them. He was always there providing constant feedback in how you were doing. And we ultimately came to be asking new leaders, have you been Ralph yet? At the heart of it, though, I think it was because Ralph was always a teacher. He set high expectations for the people he dealt with and worked with, whether they were the rabbis and cantors at Temple, other lawyers, or his regular discussion groups that he had every Saturday morning. You had to be on your toes because he had the same high standards for himself. He wouldn't take on a legal matter or a temple committee assignment unless he learned everything that there was to know about it. And he always had an opinion. He was always willing to share it. and always able to explain how he was right. And I think he was a good teacher in part because he was always a good student as well. He had a strong curiosity about people, about the world around him, and about what was happening anywhere. Even servers in restaurants, when we would go to lunch, would find themselves talking to Ralph about their life. And he was always prodding, well, where are you in school? What are you studying? What do you plan to do with it? What's your favorite subject? And during these luncheons with Ralph, usually after the server took our order eventually, the topic always turned to the latest legal ethics opinion that just came out, the state of the temple, what was going on in the world, and usually the latest new iPhone app. That was, the last subject was the only one I could keep up with him with. It seems the student in Ralph never really left him, though. It was a great source of pride to Ralph, and he made sure that people were aware that he was proud. In 2006, after almost 50 years as a lawyer, he decided that he should go back to UB and get the college degree he never got. So at 77 years old, he did. And it gave him great joy to realize that he was still learning. Even after he retired from practice, he would talk about the courses at UB that he would sign up for on a regular basis, taking classes in government, in the democratic process, in election theory, all of which he told me just to keep up. Ralph inspired everyone that spent any time with him with his keen interest in people and the world around him, his surprisingly youthful spirit and enthusiasm, and his unending curiosity. For me, his memory is already a blessing. Thank you.
Ralph was so many things. And as we just start to open and explore our memories and stories of what those things are, I was told, although I already knew it by his children last week, that he was an awesome grandfather, just purely an awesome grandfather, something I had the chance to witness. And so I'd like to call at this point a real privilege for us to be able to hear some of his bright grandchildren's thoughts. Sophie and Lydia, if you want to come on up and share some remarks in this moment about your grandfather.
I'm Lydia Halpern, and I'm Ralph's eldest grandchild. Giving these remarks feels a little bit surreal, as just 6 months ago I was giving a very similar speech at his 95th birthday. And there I remarked how I would surely be doing the same thing at his 100th. He was so vivacious and full of life that, as my sister said to me, somehow I thought he would live forever. But I'm grateful today for the opportunity to speak again about my grandfather and share with you some things about Ralph Halpern. He loved buffalo. He loved the Buffalo Bills, and Ted's hot dogs, and Anderson's frozen custard. And he loved sharing those things with his grandchildren. He loved being Jewish. He loved Judaism and the Jewish community here in Buffalo and this temple. He loved history. He loved to quiz us on historical facts. He loved trivia of any kind. His favorite piece of trivia was, what fast food chain has the most franchise locations in the world? The answer is Subway. He loved to argue about politics, about sports, about the correct answers to exam questions even after you had already taken the exam. He once tried to drive me and my sisters across the Canadian border to go to Marineland without our passports and without a note from our parents. When he was stopped by a customs official, he managed to argue his way across the border. He was a lawyer. He loved being a lawyer, and he told us often that if you love your work, you will never work a day in your life. He lived that maxim out to the fullest extent, practicing law into his late 80s and encouraging everyone in the family to go to law school. One of the very last text messages I received from him reads, "Remember to encourage Sophie to go to law school." He loved that I became a lawyer and took enormous pleasure in the years in which our legal careers overlapped, where his monthly ethics committee meetings took him to my firm's New York office and he was able to drop in on me at work. He loved reading and learning and instilled in us that our educations were the most valuable things that we had, and he ensured that his children and grandchildren had every educational opportunity available to us. He told me often that he envied the classes and opportunities I had at the educational institutions that were only within my reach because of him. He never graduated from college, instead going directly to law school without finishing his undergraduate degree. But that degree was so important to him that at the age of 77, he went back and got his diploma and walked in the University of Buffalo graduation ceremony for the first time. He was the epitome of the American dream. From the soda counter of a pharmacy in Buffalo, he created a life of incredible privilege for myself and my sisters. Everything that we have, everything that we are able to do is because of him. I try to thank him for this every chance I got, but it will never be enough. But most of all, he loved his family, his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and my Grandma Harriet, who he loved most of all, for 66 years. At every speech, at every family gathering, and there were a lot of speeches, my grandma was the final person he always thanked, telling us that without her by his side, he would not have been able to do any of it. He taught us so much, but this was the most important lesson, that there is nothing more important than family. And on that note, I have a few words to read from my sister Rosa, who is not able to be here today because she just gave birth to Ralph's third great-grandchild, a baby girl, Rome Halpern Gibson. Dear Rome, today you are 3 weeks and 2 days old. It's December 11th. My heart is so full of love for you, but it is also broken because today I lost my role model, a hero, my larger-than-life grandpa, your great-grandpa, Ralph Halpern. We cannot be at the funeral because your birth certificate has not yet been issued, but we are there in spirit. I take solace in knowing that his spirit will live on in you, the next R. Halpern, through the stories we share of him, the legacy he has left you, and the impact he has made on our family. The cycle of life and death feels especially profound today. It cannot be a coincidence that you, Rome, were born just 3 days before his generous heart gave out. Our hearts so full from meeting via FaceTime yet another great-grandchild, from caring for everyone and from making sure everyone was safe harbored in his love, full to the brim, knowing he had lived 95 years to the fullest, with a zest for life most could only aspire to. In his honor, we will teach you the values he instilled in every generation of our family: to be generous beyond measure, to put family above all, to value education, to love what you do so you never work a day in your life, to root for the underdog, and to embrace lifelong learning. As he often reminded me, it's never too late to go back to law school. Rome, I thought your name would remind me of your great-grandma's wisdom, how she ends every phone call reminding me that Rome wasn't built in a day. But now I realize it also honors your great-grandfather as well. His legacy looms as large as your namesake empire in the hearts of all who knew him. I have no doubt he is watching over you and that you will make him proud. With love, Rosa.
My name's Sophie. I am Ralph's youngest granddaughter. When writing this eulogy, I found it incredibly difficult to put into words the effect my grandfather has had on me. My grandfather was a steadfast pillar of strength within our family. He was a true patriarch whose values have weaved their way into every one of our lives. My grandfather always ensured that my family, no matter where we were across the country or what stage of life we were in, at least once a year, we all had to get together. Some of my most cherished memories with my grandfather and our whole family are our annual family vacations. There were many stipulations to the locations of these trips. It had to be warm, it had to have activities for a wide range of ages, it had to have food that would please a wide variety of palates, and maybe most importantly, we couldn't go to the same place twice. I remember my grandfather sitting at the head of the table just watching our conversations. He was perfectly happy just sitting there knowing that 3 generations of our family were all laughing together. My brother, cousins, and I have made the commitment to continue that tradition, now with an added generation, this March. Maybe the most important value that my grandfather instilled in all of us was his love for the Buffalo Bills. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston in the Brady era of Patriots football. Despite this, it was a requirement for me to grow up a Bills fan. Being a Bills fan has made me a stronger person, and it is more than just football. It's a community that comes together in the goods and the bads. A few seasons ago, my grandfather created a group chat with my entire family, affectionately titled, Go Bills. Every Sunday, we would have to sign into the group chat and tell my grandfather if we were watching and where we were watching from. Even though we would all say that we were on and watching, he would still send play-by-play text just to really ensure everyone knew what was going on. This group chat kept my family that is dispersed across Canada and the US close through the COVID pandemic, and it gave us a reason to check in with each other every week. I so wish my grandfather got to see the Bills win a Super Bowl. Josh Allen, if you are listening, could you please win this year for Grandpa? I would not be where I am today without the influence of my grandfather and his love of the law. I currently work as a paralegal at a national gun violence prevention nonprofit. I did not go straight to law school because I wasn't 100% sure that I wanted to be a lawyer. My grandfather thought this was ridiculous. Wasn't the most obvious decision in my life to become a lawyer. I didn't quite understand the impact my grandfather had on the legal community, and specifically the Buffalo legal community, until I got to college. And I started taking pre-law courses and had access to databases where I could look up his cases. I'd always seen my grandfather as just that, my grandfather. But for the first time, I saw him as a professional and was able to see the full scope of his work. Throughout college, I was very heavily involved in the mock trial team. A silver lining out of COVID was that all of the competitions were online for 2 years. And my grandfather showed up online to every one of them. Sometimes he would forget to turn off his camera or mute, but when everyone would ask whose grandfather was on screen, I would proudly say mine. And yes, he's 90 years old, and yes, he knows how to use Zoom. I wish my grandfather could have seen me get into law school, a process he undoubtedly would have been part of, as evidenced by him sending me the law school rankings when they came out every year. I wish he could have seen me graduate and become a lawyer. I know I have big shoes to fill. Throughout the past few days, my family and I have been sharing and passing on stories of the generations before us. We have discussed the incredible feat of my grandparents, being first and second generation Americans, and ensuring that the generations after them have more than they did. I can very confidently say that my grandfather accomplished that and more. His legacy will now be carried through his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. My grandfather was a spectacular man who lived a spectacular life. He lived every day of his 95 years to the fullest. Let us all take that as a lesson.
I'd now like to welcome for additional remarks Rick, Ralph, and Harriet's oldest son, along with Miriam and Lydia. He's asked to come on up. Come on back, Lydia, for support here.
I think the last time I was up on the bima was my bar mitzvah, 1972. This is going to be harder, and I've asked 2 of my daughters who are here to be with me. I want to start by thanking everybody who's here. It's great comfort to our family, and I want to thank you for coming to honor my dad. I also want to thank Mr. Brock for a beautiful set of remarks, Lydia and Sophie for saying eloquently, beautifully much of what I was going to say, even though we tried to coordinate beforehand. So I'm going to have to extemporize a bit. Let me start with a line of poetry. He who is not busy being born is busy dying. That's Robert Allen Zimmerman, probably known to most of you as Bob Dylan. My dad was being born right up until his last few hours. And you've heard about his incredible love of learning, the sense of wonderment that he saw in the world, his drive. So it's a very apt line for me, and will always have a connection now to my dad. You've also heard about the legacy that he's left, his family, the temple, Jewish community here in Buffalo, the city in Western New York. And I want to touch on a few of those things. And I want to try to do so in a way that's not repetitive. Let me start with education. It's come up in a number of times. Always learning, always seeking new knowledge. And I think for my dad, this was knowledge not for its own sake. This was knowledge that allowed us to make informed decisions. My dad never used the phrase data-driven decision-making. That wouldn't have tripped naturally off of his tongue. But that's, I think, what led him to learn to gather information, to think about diverse opinions and arguments and counter-arguments. So let me make this very personal and tell you a story, a brief one. The day I voted twice. I must have been around 7, so mid-1960s. And I went in the morning to vote with my mom, Harriet. And we went into the voting booth, and my mom, child of immigrants, grew up during Roosevelt's New Deal, walked into the voting booth, clicked the Democratic lever, and voted the party ticket. 2 minutes later, no, 90 seconds later, we left the voting booth. In the afternoon, Dad came home early with enough time to get to the polling place, and I went with him, thinking the same thing was going to happen. He closed the curtain, reached into his pocket, took out a sheaf of notes, and started working his way down the ticket. And he stopped. He went back. He moved the lever the other way. He looked at his notes. This was a revelation to me. This began a long process of trying to understand the way my dad's mind worked. It was always about informed decision-making. This leads to another observation in the same vein. My dad loved to argue. We heard the story about him getting you and the others over the border. He loved to argue with me, particularly in my youth. But he loved argument, he loved disputation, again, not for its own sake. There's something deeper here. Now, Sophie, Lydia, let me echo what you've said in slightly different words. After his great disappointment that I did not follow him on the legal career path, we both came to understand that what I did and what I do as a scholar, an author, and what he did as a lawyer, and the briefs that he wrote have some similarities. This is the marshaling of facts from a multitude of facts to fashion a compelling argument. And that line of reasoning would be challenged. In his case, by opposing counsel. In mine, in published reviews and critiques. And out of that process of contestation, we would move a bit closer to truth, even if absolute truth and certainty always would elude our grasp. Dad often said, I majored in math. And what I like about math is there's one right answer. You guys, it's all fuzzy. But nevertheless, I think he came to understand it. More importantly, I came to understand that this was an effort to get at truth that was always going to be uncertain. Even before this, the importance of books. Books as items to be cherished. When I was at university, Dad was always asking me if I needed a little bit more money for books. Was I able to afford all the books for a particular class? Even before this, in high school, when a teacher chided me for underlining in my book or writing in the margins, Dad was really clear that this was a valuable way of recording my own thoughts, my own reactions, of engaging with ideas. And that years later, he told me, you'll go back to these notes and you'll measure your growth. He didn't say intellectual growth. He said he'll measure your growth against those first thoughts. You've heard from my children, my niece. My nephew hasn't spoken, Jeremy. But you know that for them, education was a top priority. And Dad made careful plans to support them, just as he supported me and Julie and Steve in secondary education, in higher education, in graduate education. And in the case of my family, he involved Beth and myself in an elaborate but functional cost-sharing plan, believing that something as valuable as university was worth paying for. Education was also something that required work, hard work. Education had to be pursued with a sense of rigor. There were expectations, and you've heard about this. There were expectations of achieving the highest standard. And at times, particularly as kids, we felt that his standards were impossible to meet, but they drove us forward. You've heard that for Dad, being a lawyer was not labor. It certainly was not work that involved drudgery or toil. In fact, for my dad, work of any kind, as long as it was his work, was a form of fulfillment, even a form of joy. I'll use an example that some of you have heard before, because I also trotted this out, I think, at the 90th and 95th birthday parties, but it's worth repeating. I called Dad on May 12th one year, and he wasn't at home. I called him on his cell phone, he didn't pick up. I called him on the office number. This was the days before cell phones were ubiquitous. And I found him at his law firm. I said, Dad, what are you doing at work on your birthday? He said, I'm not at work. I'm at the office. I haven't been at work since I got out of the Army in 1957. Now, let me talk a little bit about values, about legacy. I think this is the important stuff. And these are the deep beliefs and the commitments that Dad passed on to me and to all of us. And I think the best way to do this is to take just a few minutes to talk about politics. And rest easy, I'm not talking about party politics. That's a topic for another time, another place. But I want to talk about politics understood as philosophy, as a way of seeing the world. My cousin Charles Halpern was here a week ago, putting his brother James Halpern to rest. And when Charles was here at Dad's 95th birthday, he gave a loving tribute to my dad, painting him as a liberal. And I think, and I suspect Charlie's watching the live cast. Charlie, I think you missed the mark, and I think you did so intentionally because you're such a loving person. My dad was something far more honorable. Just a principled, conservative. Someone who had fewer illusions that liberals have about the way the world worked. He saw its inequities. He saw that its inequities demanded a commitment to civil liberties. And I could at this point talk about his long support for reproductive rights, long before we even use that phrase. I could talk the way about Dad and his brother Harold, convinced our Rabbi Martin Goldberg from this temple, to head off to a convocation of Reform rabbis and argue on behalf of gay and lesbian rights. I could talk about his mentoring of racialized law students and young attorneys. But instead, let me make this personal. I want to tell you about two incidents that concern me almost 2 decades apart. Just 2 examples. One from the early 70s and one from the late 80s and 90s. Around about 1973, my friends and I published an underground newspaper at school called the Students' Coalition News. We rode the bus down to Main Place Mall, which had just opened, and we had them run this off on the Xerox machine. We went to school the next morning, and we put them on the benches and students' desks. Well, it probably took all of about an hour for the school authorities to figure out who was behind this. And I remember sitting in the lunchroom and one of the teachers coming up and grabbing me, and I mean grabbing me, like by the ear, and dragging me to the principal's office. Maybe they called him headmaster. And I get in there, and there's Dad and the headmaster. And I said to myself, this is it. I'm going to be expelled. I'm just going to have to take it. And the headmaster held the Students' Coalition News as if it was something horrible. And he said, this is vile. And my dad, before I could say anything, and I don't think I was capable of saying anything, said, this may be puerile, juvenile. It doesn't seem vile to me. The headmaster was taken aback. I mean, I thought he thought that Dad was going to participate in this disciplinary session. And he took his eyes off of me, and all of a sudden he snapped his eyes over to Dad. And Dad said, do the words in this issue of the Students' Coalition, did they bother you? Did they scare you? And I'm thinking, wow, this meeting is not going the way I thought it was going to go. There are more details, and I'll keep this short, so we can talk about this later. But Dad told the headmaster that even though we were children, and even though this was a private school, our First Amendment rights did not stop at the door. And they took me back to the lunchroom, and in typical Ralph Halpern fashion, when I got home that day, this was never mentioned. Second example, a decade and a half later. In the course of researching one of my books, I made a Freedom of Information Act request. And when we finally got the first papers from the Department of Justice, it was for FBI materials, they were completely redacted. Well, virtually every word on the page. My dad said, I don't believe this. You're asking for information about the 1930s and this is what you're getting? He said, I'm going to talk to somebody in my firm. They're going to handle it on a pro bono basis. And from about 1986 to 1994 or 5, we fought this through the courts. And again, this is a long story. I'd be happy to elaborate later. And I'd always believed that this was being handled on a pro bono basis by a very junior attorney in my dad's firm. Well, in the end, I won the battle and lost the war, or we won the battle and lost the war. Halpern versus Department of Justice ruled, in the end, that the Federal Bureau of Investigation could not hold on to material from the 1930s and claim it was in the national security interests of the United States. But any information that shed light on the internal workings of the Bureau could be redacted. And so it ended. And I never used any of this material. It was such a drawn-out process in the book that I was writing. And I always believed, until a few weeks ago, that this had been handled on a pro bono basis by the firm. Well, I've learned it was not handled on a pro bono basis. My dad paid for this. This is not a resource that most young historians have at their disposal. And the reason I share this example with you is because I think it underscores the importance of my dad's belief in having information, the importance of access to information in order for democratic society to function well and fully. Let me move to a conclusion here by talking about Buffalo. And this has come up several times. And I did want to talk about the Bills, but Sophie is the most ardent Bills fan in our family, and I proudly and lovingly yielded that bit to her. But Dad spent 91 of his 95 years in Buffalo, New York. It's only his 1 year teaching at Northwestern in Chicago and his years in the Army that took him out of Buffalo. He loved Buffalo. You've heard about his love for the Jewish community, his commitment to templebethzion and Western New York's Jewish community. But I can't leave you here without emphasizing the larger Buffalo community. And I got to see that, I've been privileged to see this very clearly, as have some of you here, working with my dad for the last several decades in something called the Reichley Foundation. The Reichley Foundation gives grants to Western New York in 4 areas. These won't surprise you. Education, of course, the arts, social justice and social entrepreneurship, and anti-poverty. And I came to understand that Dad knew so much, not just about our circle or Jewish Buffalo, but about so much that was going on in the refugee community here, Polish community, Italian community, African American community, really pretty incredible. And again, this will be the last story I tell you. This one does have a title. It's called Ryan, Rick, and Ralph Go for a Drive. Just a few years ago, my son-in-law Ryan, who grew up in a small town in Ontario, was with us in the summer in Buffalo. And Dad said, let's go see the site of the drugstore where my dad held court for many decades. Let's go see the home I grew up in. And we got in the car. We drove down Jefferson, actually past the site of the top shooting, which was quite emotional for all of us. But we drove to Best Street, the site of the drugstore. We wound up at Linden Park, his old house. And this is a very different neighborhood today than it was when Ralph and Harold were growing up there with Mary and Julius. And we got out of a pretty nice car, 3 white guys. And I got out first, I think, because I wanted to take a photo of the house. And there was 2 men working on under the hood of a car, and they looked at us in a very suspicious way. And I explained, I have my dad here with me. He grew up in this house. He's 91 years old. Would you like to meet him? And this just melted the ice, and they came over. And I'm thinking to myself, as Dad is slowly getting his 90-year-old body out of the car, this could go well, or this could go really badly. And it went extraordinarily well. And here's why. Linden Park, where their house is, if you look east, doesn't face Humboldt Park anymore. It faces a wall of concrete, where in the early 1960s, city planners, in their wisdom, put the Kensington Expressway. And about a week or so earlier, the Buffalo News had run a very big front-page story about elaborate plans to bury the expressway and rejoin the community to Humboldt Park at the cost of billions and billions and billions of dollars. And I think this came about the time that billions and billions of dollars were earmarked to build the Bills a new stadium. And Dad was able to find common ground with the current resident of the house by talking about what both agreed was a very poorly conceived plan to cover the expressway and restore Humboldt Park. And then both of them, smiling, began talking about the ways in which the money would be better spent on the community and on the residents of the community itself. Well, that was my dad, able to find common ground with just about anybody. So let me end, and I want to end with another poem. Nikki Giovanni predeceased my dad by a day. She wrote a very short poem about her own death. I hope I die warmed by the life I tried to live. Ralph Halpern died warm, for sure, but equally as important, maybe more so, he warmed the lives of others and will continue to do so. Thank you.
I think with Ralph's wide interest for learning and literature, many of us, Rick, had the same idea of turning to poetry for inspiration. As I was looking through my files for something that I felt in this moment as we pay tribute to Ralph, I came across this poem actually by an anonymous author called "The World Changed" that I'd like to share with you. The world changed forever. We stood at a divide. One moment, the breath of our loved one lingered in the air. The next, absence treated before us. Like an ocean with no end, we were left with memory and time. Time surrounds us, wearing the face of the past, wearing the face of tomorrow. Grief and mourning form a path that leads us on. Time does not heal. We heal ourselves. As we allow ourselves to grieve, we heal each other. As we allow each to mourn. We heal as we come to know how our loved one nurtured, challenged, provoked, and soothed. We heal as we learn to feel the unique rhythms in ourselves that, were it not for one life, we never would know. We gather together in remembrance. The laughter of memory mixes with the tears of loss, and we recognize how quickly time passes us by without waiting for our struggles, successes, on our dreams. Let this moment awaken within us a sense of urgency, a respect for the unceasing motion of time. Let us know, as Ralph did, that every moment is precious as we feel the warmth of compassion and the strength of connection. May Ralph's memory, our loved one, bless our actions and our thoughts. May the grace of his 95 good years reach out and touch us and give us strength. May their light burn brightly within our hearts, our souls, and our minds. Like you mentioned, Rick, so much of what I would add has already been expressed beautifully by you, by your daughter and your niece, by our friend, Mr. Brock. And so as I consider what else to share, I share that I only knew Ralph for 1/40th of his life, and yet the news that I got last Wednesday shook me, went straight through me. For 2.5 years, I consider myself so lucky that I got Ralphed, that I got to hear those wise words several times, mentioned the importance of English to Ralph, which we all know, on how to draw more young people into our temple, onto our committees. And for the rabbi, the sermons that were best were always the political ones that would bring in the crowds. I hear about his experience being part of our not only congregation, but our worldwide movement for Reform Judaism. In fact, Ralph was one of the principal members of an important committee created around the turn of the millennium, Synagogue 2000, that thought about how to relate temple to our lives in the contemporary world, a world that has changed and that continues to change unceasingly. Through my time here, Ralph would regularly email me notes, usually right after the end of each service, before I even got in my car to make it home. He'd point out the strength of each particular sermon or its deficits, and in recent months, I must say I grew concerned as they grew far more complimentary. And a familiar catchphrase graced them too regularly. Rabbi, tonight's sermon hit it out of the park. You can hear the love of sports there in that expression. When we gather together as a Jewish family or a Jewish community to share thoughts, prayers with each other, it is considered imperative that we also share words of Torah, words of our tradition, wisdom that elevates us. And I share these knowing that Ralph actually did not share advice all that often. Rather, he was one who led by example. He'd tell you what he expected you to do, not advising you to do it, just that's the way it was. And so too, there are no coincidences, because this week in our Torah, we encounter a new generation of ancestors, the generation of Jacob's children. And as we pray that these moments bring families closer together, so too we acknowledge that there were divisions in this generation, that there was jealousy, that there were challenges, that those who were less successful experienced jealousy of he who was more successful, namely Joseph. And just as Ralph's greatest love was his family and his children, so too this was for Jacob. You know, Jacob's there to help sharpen every idea and every thought. And as Joseph starts to share his dreams with his brothers, first they're offended and then with his father, and he asks, do you really mean what you're saying here? Do you really expect that your brothers are going to bow down to you, to worship you? What chutzpah. What chutzpah to think such a thing. But then there's something really remarkable that's said. He tells Joseph, after noting what happened, after seeing the conflicts, after seeing the tension, Joseph, go check on the peace of your brothers. Ask them about their peace, how they're doing, what's happening. That impetus, that urge, that focus for Joseph in the end deserves more credit than anything for the fact that these brothers will ultimately reconcile. That these brothers' bonds will grow stronger and stay through successive generations, so that years to come, no longer will they be one large family, but a people all unto themselves. I think Ralph would endorse a similar message in this moment. That in this moment, what matters most is how we're present with each other, how we're there for each other, concerned about each other, interested and curious in what each other are thinking, what each other are doing, and that ultimately that brings us closer together in peace. I feel blessed to be among Ralph's friends, as I know so many of us in this room do. He was amazing, simply amazing, and I think of the occasions that I spent with him from his 95th birthday to when we gathered not so long ago for your father's unveiling, and I sat across the table from Sophie, and I heard him prodding her, "When are you applying to law school?" Indeed, he was so proud of you, of each and every one of you, and Sophie and Jeremy and Lydia and Miriam and Rosa, who I know is watching online, and the great grandkids, little baby Rome, who's out there, the icing on the cake. You, Harriet, you were his deep love, the thing that started it all, and so we hold on to this love, knowing that this love is the thing that will help to keep us whole in this grief, knowing that that love that Ralph showed so strongly, passionately, adamantly, love that he would say was the most important, for the most important things in his life, his family, is not going to fade or go away, but rather can be there forever as a loving memory that it may grow. Now, I mentioned that Ralph's not a huge advocate of Hebrew. He thought that the meaning of Hebrew could be obtuse and challenging, but there is a little bit of Hebrew that we're going to share before we conclude what it is we're doing here in this room. And I'd like to start by going back to that concept of love as I share with us. Love has many different ways of being expressed in English, and languages, most of them have many different words for love, but in our sacred tongue, Hebrew, there is actually only one. That word is ahava. What ahava conveys is not a romantic love or a sense of one's heart bursting with love or butterflies in the stomach. The word ahava represents responsibility, a care, the willingness of a person to give up from their own possessions things to care for, to sustain, to support, to help those that they love. When we love another person, we do everything in our power, even putting their interests above our own. And so, Ralph's memory will be paid best homage by those who knew him best and loved him most, all of his friends, not only at Temple Bethzion, but throughout the Buffalo community, most of all, his family. His wife, you, Harriet, his children, Rick, Julie, and Steve, his children-in-law, his grandchildren, and their spouses, along with his great-grandchildren, all of his nieces and nephews, his cousins, some of them we heard watching online, and Charlie, thinking in particular of you in this moment. And so, as we consecrate that love here as not something of memory, but something to continue to live within our lives, that devotion, that support, we rise first to hear the words of the memorial prayer, Al Maleh in Hebrew, before reading them in English. You can find it in the middle of your pamphlet. Please rise.
El malei rachamim shochein bamromim hametzeh menucha nechona al kanfei את נשמת ישראל בן יהודה וחיים מרים שהלך לעולמו. בעל הרחמים יסיריהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. בטרור בטרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו. ינוח בשלום על משכבו ונאמר Amen.
Lord, full of mercy, who dwells on high, find fitting rest upon the wings of the Shekhinah, in the heights of the holy and pure, who shine like the glow of the firmament. For the soul of Ralph Halpern, known among our people as Israel, that is Jacob, father of the 12 tribes, Israel, the son of Yehudah, Judah, and Chaya, Miriam, sister of Moses and source of life. God, bind up his memory. We pray for his soul. May his resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, may the Master of Mercy shelter him in the shelter of God's wings forever. And may God bind his soul in the bond of life. The Lord is his inheritance, and may he rest peacefully upon his resting place. Let us say,
Amen.
Thank you for being here, everyone. This concludes the sanctuary portion of our service. We're now going to be going in procession to Forest Lawn Cemetery. If you are going with us in procession, we ask that you turn on your bright lights and your four-way flashers. We'll be taking it nice and slow. Right now, I'm going to have the pallbearers come forward. Everyone else, if you could just stay in your seats for a moment. Also, anyone going to the cemetery, bring these pamphlets with you. They have the mourner's Kaddish prayer in them, and the Shiva information is also at the bottom. And the immediate family will follow behind. Thank you.